Ready to dive into some deep waters today.
Always up for a challenge.
We're tackling excerpts from The Discrimination Myth.
Ooh, that sounds like it could be controversial.
Potentially. The author is Frank Karsten. Does that name ring a bell?
Well, yeah, Frank Karsten. Definitely not afraid to shake things up.
You got that right. Founder of the More Freedom Foundation.
Co-founded the Mises Institute Netherlands, too.
And get this, he co-authored Beyond Democracy.
Which has been translated into, 21 languages?
Yep, 21 languages.
Yep.
So clearly he's got some strong opinions.
And he's not shy about sharing them.
We're not here to tell you what to think about discrimination, though.
More like giving you a framework for understanding.
Exactly. We'll break down Karsten's arguments, help you see his perspective.
Because this topic is complex. And we all come in with assumptions.
Right. And sometimes those assumptions, well, they can be more harmful than helpful.
For sure.
So Karsten jumps right in, tackling what he calls Myth 1.
Myth 1. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that?
Discrimination is injustice, hatred, and violence.
Getting right to the heart of it.
He argues that discrimination isn't inherently immoral.
Wait, really? That's a bold statement.
It might sound counterintuitive at first.
It definitely does.
But he uses this wild court case as an example. I think you'll find this interesting.
Okay, lay it on me.
This 77-year-old guy, Rolf Eden, sued a 19-year-old woman.
Wow, 77 and 19. Okay, this is already juicy. Why? What happened?
Her name was Pathrina Weiss, and she refused to sleep with him.
She refused, and he sued her.
Yep. He sued her for age discrimination.
Oh, wow. I don't even know what to say to that.
It does sound like something out of a sitcom.
It totally does.
But Karsten uses this to make a point, to show how absurd it is to force people to associate with each other.
Yeah, forcing someone to be intimate. That crosses a line.
Definitely. And he's not condoning hate or violence. There's a clear distinction between discrimination and violence.
Right, because saying you don't want to date someone is different from assaulting them.
Exactly. Discrimination is about the reason for exclusion, not the act itself.
So it's like, I don't have to invite everyone to my party.
Right. It's your choice.
But if I start punching people I don't like, that's a whole other problem.
Exactly. And this takes us to myth 2. To discriminate is immoral.
Another big one. Lay it on me.
Karsten again challenges the conventional view. Judging people based on things they can't change, he says, isn't automatically wrong.
That's an interesting thought. So what, like judging someone based on their height or their race?
Those are some examples, yeah. And this is where things get really tricky. He dives into this idea of irrelevant characteristics.
Irrelevant characteristics?
Yeah, like if you use certain traits to make decisions, those traits become relevant.
So like in hiring?
Hiring, dating, choosing friends, even something like a height preference on a dating app.
So he's saying that's discrimination too?
He argues it is.
Interesting. But how do you separate preference from actual prejudice, especially in something like hiring? Where's the line?
It's tough. That's a huge question. And Karsten then goes on to myth 3, you don't discriminate.
Oh, I like where this is going.
Right. He calls the reader out. He's basically saying, don't fool yourself. You discriminate every single day.
Because we all do, right? Whether we admit it or not.
Exactly. He argues we make judgments based on limited information.
Especially when it comes to safety, yeah. I could see that.
Like if you're walking alone at night.
Oh, absolutely. You see a group of people.
You can't help but make assumptions.
You try to read them, see if they look friendly.
It's instinctual.
Total instinct. And you mentioned dating apps before.
Swiping left, swiping right.
Based on a photo and a few lines of text.
Instant judgments about people we've never even met.
It's true. We all do it.
Okay, so that brings us to myth 4. Prejudice is wrong.
Let me guess, he's going to say it's not.
He actually argues that prejudice judging based on limited information is a tool we all use.
A tool. Like a mental shortcut.
Think of it that way, yeah. It helps us make quick decisions. He compares it to how generalizations work in science.
Making sense of patterns in data.
Right. He gives this example of research on group differences. It's about childhood development, measured by the Denver Development Screening Test.
Okay, so he's looking at real data here.
He also talks about the correlation between SAT scores and the societal achievements of different ethnicities.
Controversial stuff. But I guess his point is that ignoring those patterns doesn't mean they don't exist.
That's a big part of it. He says we need honest conversations about these differences, even when they make us uncomfortable.
I see his point. Avoiding the conversation doesn't make the issue go away.
And get this. He even argues prejudice can be beneficial.
Beneficial. In what context?
He uses the example of law enforcement, specifically Israeli airline El Al.
They have really strict security.
Right. They profile passengers, and he contrasts that with the Rotherham scandal in the UK.
The Rotherham scandal, that was awful.
Authorities were hesitant to investigate child sexual abuse.
Because they didn't want to appear racist.
It's a horrific example, but it makes you think about the trade-offs. Preventing discrimination versus protecting vulnerable people.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Where's the line?
And that leads us to myth 5. Discrimination is the main cause of social inequality. Karsten takes on the nature versus nurture debate head-on.
Okay, that's a big one.
He questions this idea that environmental factors are the sole cause of disparities.
So like, it's not all about upbringing or opportunity.
He throws out some thought-provoking examples, like why are there so many black athletes in sprinting?
But not as many in swimming.
Right. Could that be due to genetics alongside cultural influences?
So it's not just one or the other, but a combination. Interesting.
And then he flips it and asks, why aren't there more female CEOs?
A good question.
He suggests there might be something he calls a motivation ceiling at play.
A motivation ceiling? What's that?
It's the idea that societal expectations, gender roles, how men and women are raised, could play a role.
So it's not just about overt discrimination, but those more subtle influences.
Even things like dating preferences, as seen on sites like OkCupid. He cites that as an example.
So our preferences play into larger societal patterns. That makes sense.
And he ties this into Dr. Warren Farrell's research, who argues men are more likely to work longer hours.
Choose riskier, higher-paying jobs, right?
Right. And prioritize their careers over family life.
And I guess that could tie into the biological differences between men and women, too.
Yeah. Karsten suggests that men's higher testosterone levels could be contributing to that competitiveness and risk-taking.
It's that interplay of nature and nurture again.
And we can't ignore biology, he says, when trying to understand social inequality.
Wow, we've covered a lot already. My brain is doing backflips.
I know, right? 5 myths down and so much more to unpack.
And I have a feeling things are about to get even more controversial. Back for more myth busting.
You bet. My brain is still buzzing from those first 5 myths.
Well, get ready, because Karsten doesn't let up. He dives into some really touchy subjects.
Like myth 6, all people are equal.
Ooh, that's a big one. And, on the surface, it sounds like a good thing.
Right. Who wouldn't want everyone to be equal? But Karsten argues that clinging to this myth can actually be harmful.
Harmful how?
He starts by asking us to think about physical differences. Like, we all accept that men are generally taller than women.
Right, on average.
Or that certain ethnicities might be more prone to certain diseases.
Okay, so we accept those differences.
But when it comes to mental abilities, suddenly it's taboo to even suggest there might be group differences.
You mean like intelligence?
Yeah, stuff like IQ. And Karsten argues that this denial is not only unscientific, but it can lead to more prejudice. Because if we refuse to acknowledge potential differences in things like IQ, we resort to stereotypes to explain disparities.
So instead of confronting the possibility of differences, we fall back on simplistic explanations.
Exactly. And that doesn't help anyone. He argues that acknowledging differences, even if they're uncomfortable, is actually more honest.
More honest, and maybe more productive in the long run.
That's his point. And he uses this concept called the normal distribution curve. Remember that from stats class?
Vaguely.
Bell curve.
Yep, the bell curve. And the key takeaway is that even small differences in the average between groups can lead to big differences at the extremes.
Okay, I think I see where he's going with this.
So, for example, if the average IQ for one group is slightly higher than another group, you'll see a lot more geniuses in the group with the higher average.
So it's not just about the average, it's about the spread of abilities within each group. Interesting.
Right. And that can have a big impact, especially in fields like academics, science, or leadership.
Right, because those fields often require a very high level of cognitive ability.
And Karsten doesn't shy away from the controversial implications of this. He delves into genetics and evolutionary psychology. You mean like, are some of these differences in mental abilities hardwired into our DNA?
That's what he suggests. He argues that millions of years of evolution could have shaped not just our physical traits, but also our brains.
And therefore, how we think and behave.
He's careful not to say it's all genetics, but he argues that we can't dismiss the possibility that biology plays a role.
It's a lot to consider. And it kind of sets the stage for his next myth. Myth 7. Only white men can be racist and sexist.
And this is where he really pushes back against the current narrative around discrimination.
How so?
He argues that racism and sexism are about judging someone as superior or inferior based on their race or gender, no matter who's doing the judging.
So it's not about who's in power or who historically has been in control?
He thinks that definition is too limited. People of any race or gender can hold prejudiced views, right?
Sure. Prejudice can exist anywhere.
And to prove his point, he includes these examples of statements made by minority figures that would be considered racist or sexist if they came from a white man.
So he's calling out a double standard.
That's exactly what he's doing. It's like the rules are different depending on who's speaking.
Which brings up white privilege. Does Karsten talk about that?
He does. He acknowledges it, but critiques it as being too narrow.
Too narrow how?
He points out that there are all kinds of privilege. Tall privilege, beauty privilege, athletic privilege.
Okay, I see. So he's not denying that white people have benefited from historical racism.
Not at all. But he's saying that white privilege as a concept doesn't tell the whole story.
And it can be divisive too, right?
He argues that it can actually create resentment among white people and fuel white nationalism.
Instead of focusing on white privilege, he thinks we should be tackling things like poverty.
Lack of educational opportunities, those root causes of inequality.
Makes sense.
Okay, ready for myth 8?
Hit me.
Anti-discrimination laws work. And here, Karsten gets into the nuts and bolts of policy.
And how those policies, even with good intentions, can have unintended consequences.
He says that while anti-discrimination laws might sound good in theory, they can actually backfire.
Backfire how?
He uses the example of religious discrimination lawsuits. Like, there was this Muslim flight attendant, Cherise Stanley, who sued because she wasn't allowed to wear a headscarf.
I think I remember that case.
She won. But Karsten argues that these kinds of victories can make employers more hesitant to hire people from certain religious groups.
Because they're afraid of lawsuits.
Exactly. It's all about risk. If employers are worried about being sued, they might avoid hiring people who they think are more likely to sue.
Even if those people are perfectly qualified for the job.
It's a lose-lose situation. The laws designed to protect people might actually make it harder for them to get hired.
He calls it a chilling effect, right? Like it discourages employers from taking a chance on certain candidates.
Exactly. And he brings up the Ellen Pao case against Kleiner Perkins.
Ah, that was a big one in Silicon Valley.
Kleiner Perkins won, but their reputation suffered, and it sent a message to other companies. Even the perception of discrimination can be costly.
So what does he propose instead? Get rid of all anti-discrimination laws.
He doesn't go that far, but he definitely thinks we need to rethink our approach to these policies.
Think about those unintended consequences more carefully.
And ask if these laws are really doing more harm than good.
Okay, what about affirmative action? Does he address that?
Yep. Myth 9, affirmative action works. Another hot button issue.
What's his take?
He argues that it can have negative consequences, despite its good intentions.
Like?
Well, he talks about the stigma of tokenism.
Ah, right. That feeling of being hired just to fill a quota.
Exactly. And it can be really demotivating for the individuals involved. He cites research showing lower graduation rates for Black law students admitted through affirmative action.
So he's suggesting that affirmative action might set some students up for failure by putting them in environments they're not ready for.
He also says it can lead to a lowering of standards,
which can end up hurting everyone in the long run.
It's a thorny issue. No easy answers. But he forces us to confront those potential downsides.
Makes you think.
Okay, let's tackle myth 10. Equal pay reduces the gender pay gap. This is another one that gets a lot of attention.
And I'm guessing Karsten has an unconventional view.
He questions whether the gender pay gap is solely due to discrimination. He brings up Dr. Warren Farrell's research again.
The one about men choosing riskier, higher-paying jobs.
And working longer hours, prioritizing career over family. He's saying that the pay gap might be more about choices than about outright discrimination.
Interesting. So it's more nuanced than just women are paid less for the same work.
He also points out that if women really could be paid less for the same work, wouldn't there be more all-female companies?
Huh. That's a good point. If it were that simple, why wouldn't businesses just hire all women and save money?
And here's where it gets really interesting. He argues that equal pay laws could actually make things worse for women.
Worse?
Think about it. If employers are forced to pay women the same as men, even if they perceive them as being less productive or less committed,
they might just choose to hire more men to avoid the risk.
Exactly. Another example of good intentions gone wrong.
I'm sensing a pattern here.
And that brings us to myth 11. Government policies reduce discrimination. Karsten is pretty skeptical about government solutions, to say the least.
He's a libertarian. Yeah.
So he leans towards free markets over government intervention.
What policies does he target?
The minimum wage is a big one. He says it prices out low-skilled workers who are often minorities.
He's saying the minimum wage hurts the very people it's supposed to help.
That's his argument. He also criticizes mandated sick leave and maternity leave,
saying they made certain groups, especially women, less appealing to employers.
Right. It increases the cost of hiring them. And then there are ban-the-box laws.
The ones that prevent employers from asking about criminal history.
He says they can lead to more discrimination, too.
How so?
Because if employers can't ask about criminal history, they might avoid hiring from groups that are more likely to have a criminal record.
Which often means minorities. So, by trying to help one group, you might end up hurting another.
The law of unintended consequences strikes again.
All right, what's next?
Myth 12. Anti-discrimination laws foster cohesion. Karsten argues that we've actually become more polarized.
Because of those laws. But they're meant to bring people together.
He thinks that by expanding the definition of discrimination and making everyone super sensitive, we've created a culture of fear.
Like people are afraid to say anything that could be perceived as offensive.
He brings up the Tim Hunt incident, a Nobel laureate forced to resign over a joke about female colleagues.
Yeah, I remember that. Sparked a huge debate.
And then there was Charlotte Proudman, the lawyer, who called out a guy on LinkedIn for complimenting her profile picture.
Oh, wow. I'd forgotten about that one.
These incidents show how easily things can blow up.
And it makes people hesitant to even interact.
Karsten's point is that this hypersensitivity is preventing honest dialogue.
It's like we're so focused on being politically correct that we're afraid to talk to each other.
Okay, ready for myth 13. Businesses willingly discriminate.
Let's hear it.
Karsten pushes back against this idea that businesses are inherently racist or sexist.
He thinks they're more motivated by profit.
Right, exactly. He argues that in a free market, it just doesn't make economic sense to discriminate.
So businesses are more likely to hire the best candidate, regardless of their race or gender.
He uses the example of Google and Microsoft, both of which have had Indian CEOs.
Hardly bastions of white supremacy.
He acknowledges that personal prejudices exist, but the profit motive tends to override them.
Okay, but what about things like hiring bias? I've heard there's a lot of research showing that even well-intentioned people can discriminate unconsciously.
He talks about that, using Airbnb as an example. They've implemented all these policies to try to reduce discrimination on their platform.
Like hiding profile pictures.
Right, and encouraging instant booking. But Karsten points out that these measures can backfire.
If hosts feel like they can't choose their guests freely, they might just stop renting out their properties.
Again, unintended consequences.
All right, bring on the final myth.
Myth 14, segregation is wrong. And here, Karsten challenges a deeply held moral belief.
Because most people would agree that segregation is bad.
Right. It brings up images of Jim Crow, apartheid. But he makes a distinction between government-enforced segregation and voluntary segregation.
So being forced to live in a segregated community versus choosing to live in a neighborhood with people who share your values.
Exactly. He argues that we engage in voluntary segregation all the time. We choose our neighborhoods, our clubs, our friends.
We gravitate towards people who are like us. It's natural.
And he points out that even politicians who preach diversity often live in segregated communities themselves.
That's a good point. Practice what you preach, right?
So after deconstructing all these myths, where does Karsten leave us? What are we supposed to do with all these ideas?
Well, that's what we'll explore in part 3. We'll shift gears a bit and focus on what all of this means for you, the listener, in your everyday life.
All right, we've spent the last 2 parts unpacking Frank Karsten's arguments in the Discrimination Myth. Kind of a mind-blowing book, right?
It really challenges you to think differently about some really sensitive issues.
He's poked holes in so many common assumptions about prejudice, about inequality, about the role of government.
But now, let's get practical. What does all this mean for us, for people listening, in their everyday lives?
That's the million-dollar question, and Karsten actually tackles that head-on.
Oh, he does.
The last section of the book is titled, Help, I Am a Victim of Discrimination.
Okay, so he's acknowledging that people do experience discrimination.
He does, but what's interesting is that he doesn't dwell on the victimhood narrative. He flips it and says, what can you do about it?
Empowering people to take action. I like that.
It's about focusing on what you can control
instead of the things you can't, like other people's prejudices.
Exactly. So what can you control? Well, Karsten says, focus on self-improvement.
Make yourself more valuable. No matter what.
Acquire new skills, gain knowledge, make yourself so good they can't ignore you.
Become indispensable.
He also talks about adapting to social norms.
Now, that's a tricky one.
It is. Because it could sound like you're just giving in to the system.
Conforming to the very thing you might be fighting against.
Right. But he's not saying to abandon your values.
It's more about, like, picking your battles.
I think so, yeah. Maybe you have to conform in some areas so that you can excel in others.
Where you can really make a difference.
And knowing when to push back, when to stand your ground.
Knowing which battles are worth fighting.
And he emphasizes focusing on your positive qualities.
Sounds simple, but it's so easy to get caught up in the negative.
Dwelling on our flaws.
We forget about what makes us awesome.
So showcase your talents, your skills, your accomplishments.
Shine a light on what makes you unique.
And he talks about connecting with people, even those who might be different from you.
Understanding where they're coming from.
He doesn't say you have to excuse their prejudices, but understanding those viewpoints might help you navigate tricky situations.
It's about empathy, isn't it? Even when it's hard.
So what's the big takeaway from the discrimination myth? What should listeners walk away with?
I think Karsten's main point is this. Discrimination exists. It's a reality, but it doesn't have to define your life.
You have the power to choose how you respond to it.
You can focus on the unfairness, or you can focus on what you can control.
Your actions, your choices, your growth.
Even in a world where discrimination exists, you still have agency. You can still build a good life for yourself.
It's a message of resilience, adaptability, taking responsibility.
And remember, this is just the start of the conversation. Karsten's book is a starting point. It's meant to make you think.
So keep thinking, read more, ask questions, and keep talking about these issues honestly and openly.
That's how we learn and grow. That's how we build a better world.
We've only scratched the surface here.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it thought-provoking.
See you next time.